Okay, Globalization Good, take 4. This is the second lecture. The first one was just an introduction to the course, and this is a lecture with a PowerPoint. I don't make too many PowerPoints, but this is one of them, and it's based mostly on the Deardorff and Stern article, which is available online, so hopefully you have the paper, and if you have not read it, read it as soon as you can. So globalization is good. What do we mean by globalization? Um, Globalization means many things, very broadly, not just economic, culture and language and all these other good things. But we're going to talk about economic globalization. And to an economist, it typically means three things: increase in the international movements, crossing borders of goods and services. That's one, international trade. Two, movement in capital across borders, both portfolio investment, but also longer-term investment, foreign direct investment, building factories by Honda in Thailand, for example, and movement of people, labor migration. So movement in goods and capital and labor. That's international economics in a nutshell. Nowadays we call it globalization, a term sort of invented in the so-called West, probably in America in the 90s. And that's what economic globalization means to us economists. There's a few more things than that. Growth and expanded scope of institutions that straddle national borders. Firms are one of them, of course, global multinational corporations, MNCs, governments such as the EU. France and Germany have their governments, but on top of that, there's a supranational European Commission and other types of national, supranational governments. International institutions like the World Bank and IMF, and NGOs such as Doctors Without Borders. For some, globalization is disagreeable. For some countries, globalization is a new thing. So for the United States and to EU to some extent, trade and investment and foreign presence in the economy is much, much more than it was 50 years ago, and there's lots of benefits to that, but for some people it's a new thing, and some people feel that it's, in the words of Deardorff and Stern, that they're helpless against it, and perhaps is disagreeable. They don't like globalization because maybe there's some costs to them. But let's ask a more fundamental question: has globalization really increased? Well, if we're an economist, we like to measure things with data. So let's look at data in three ways: movement in trade, movement in capital, and movement in people. First, this is from the Deardorff and Stern paper. This is old data, patched together very carefully by Crafts. We don't have all the data for all the countries of the world, going back to 1890 or so. So this is what we're working with. What we want to measure here is not just is trade going up, but is trade going up as a share of GDP? Because naturally you'd assume that if there's more economic activity, there should be more global economic activity. But is trade as a share of GDP really going up? So here we have France and Germany, and Japan I've colored in red, and then the UK and US, and some world average. Let's look at Japan. So back in 1890 or so small I can't read it myself, Japanese exports as a share of Japanese GDP is estimated to be around 5%. We can see that rose in 1913, fell, but it's around 10% until the 1980s or 90s. England is the white one. England was actually had larger amounts of exports as a share of UK GDP before World War I, and we could even say that England was more globalized in the 19th century than it is in early 20th century than today. So it's not actually shocking, perhaps as shocking as you might think, at least until the 90s. Now I have some recent data. This is an index. It's world imports rather than exports as a share of world GDP. It's more recent, so it's more accurate. Professor Baldwin has made this an index, so that's 75% on the left side is not percent. But we can see it's through the 80s, the imports as a share of GDP was pretty high, although not terribly high, depending on the country. But it rose a lot in the late 90s. This is where the anti-globalization perhaps reached a pinnacle, and indeed 2002 is when, or 2001 is when Deardorff and Stern wrote their paper. And then it was a pretty high level compared to historical levels. And then in 2008 we have the global financial crisis, and GDPs fall, but trade really plummets. And what I don't have here is that ends in 2009. My little that gray square is blocking it out. But trade collapsed, but it's bounced back up. Now this year we have another global economic crisis, and trade is collapsing, and it probably will collapse more than this 2009 collapse. We have one more slide, not from the Deardorff-Stern paper because that's pretty old, but this also shows trade, merchandise trade, that's goods, as a share of GDP for various countries, and we can see it was very high before, pretty high before World War II. But the Great Depression and the trade war, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of America, really reduced trade as a share of GDP. But then after the war, trade as a share of GDP has been steadily rising. And we're going to talk about why that's the case. Here we have some trade as a share of GDP. We see Hong Kong is, I don't know, what's that, 180% or something? Malaysia, 111%. And we have Japan and the United States way in the bottom. Trade as a share of GDP, 14%. But again, that 14% for Japan, or that 11% for the United States, is double what it used to be in the 1960s, for example, before I was born. So for my parents, the world is much more global trade-wise than it was when they were working. But again, maybe not as dramatic as you would think. Now, why has overall trade gone up, aggregate or absolute amounts? Well, GDP growth. More growth means more trade, and more trade across borders as well. So that's most of it. One paper by Bear and I think it's Bergstrand says that of the increase in trade in the post-war period, about 2/3 of it is because just more GDP. Technology is about 25%, and 8% is lower tariffs. And we're going to show how much the tariffs have been lowered over the years. By technology, we mean lots of things. Telecommunications would be in there. But we usually think of shipping, the container revolution of the 1960s, which made shipping things much faster and cheaper, and also air freight. Both just the cost of sending things in a plane. 50 years ago, you would never imagine roses from Chile being put in an airplane and flown all the way to Alaska to be sold for Valentine's Day in February, where it's negative 20 degrees. But now they do that. Or catch a tuna in the Atlantic Ocean, flash freeze it, put it in an airplane, and ship it to the markets in Tokyo for sale the next day. So that's where we talk about technology and that increasing trade as well. But freer trade and trade liberalization, lower tariffs, is also important. Second way we can measure globalization, movement in capital. Well, the way we do that, again, Crafts has gone back to some of the major countries that had good data 100 years ago, and looks at foreign assets as a share of GDP. And a foreign asset means one citizen or firm owning something in another country. So maybe a British investor buys some stocks, or a railroad company in America. So that's British guy investing and holding assets in America. So if we, again, go back to the Deardorff-Stern paper, we see going back to 1870 on the far left, foreign assets were less than 10% of world GDP. And then in 1980, indeed they went up, and they went down during the Great Depression and World War II, and they rise kind of steadily. Pretty big jump in 1980, and then really big jump in 1995. And if this graph went on further, this would be off the charts, probably double or more what it is. and that's already 60%. So it's probably 100%. Foreign assets are probably greater than world GDP at this point. So why? One thing is to say that yes, globalization in international flow of capital is we are definitely more globalized. That's why the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009 didn't just damage America. It had worldwide shocks, and those were fast and rapid and painful because we're more interconnected, very interconnected in the financial markets. Jumping backwards a little bit, why do we have this big jump from 1960 to 1980? A few things. One, end of the GATT. Well, not at the end of the GATT, my apologies. The end of the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system, which also had huge capital controls. The most so-called free country currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. And that system existed from something like 1947 until 1971, 73, where it broke down. But in that system of fixed exchange rates, there's also capital controls. So capital was not allowed to flow freely across borders, and this helped maintain the stable fixed exchange rates, for better or for worse. What else happened in the 80s? Well, in 1979, Japan, who had a lot of capital controls that they imposed themselves, decided to relax them and get rid of them. So Japanese citizens and firms, by law, it was very hard for them to buy dollars or to buy foreign assets. They had to get special permission from the Ministry of Finance. That capital control went away in 1979 and 80, and Japanese who had a lot of savings were able to invest all around the world. And so we saw Japanese firms buying golf courses in Hawaii and Rockefeller Center in New York City. And there was a backlash in America to some extent then, wrongly, but it did occur. Indeed, that's when President Trump was in his prime, wheeling and dealing and buying real estate all around the world and in New York. Oil money would be one of other many reasons of changes in the 80s. OPEC had been formed, oil prices were very high, people were paying dollars to buy oil from Saudi Arabia and other places, and they were getting those dollars and recycling them back, investing, making accounts in European banks and buying real estate in America and around the world. Financial innovation, banks and financial institutions were figuring out new ways to package and sell investment products. Regular old technology increases as well. Telecommunications. You had, I think it was called the teletype machine, but then you have the telephone, of course, and the fax machine, which helped rich countries that had them, like New York, be able to do more financial transactions with the European markets. And of course, in the 80s and 90s, with the computer and the internet, made all of this easier. All this telecommunications infrastructure, technology, made it easier to invest all around the world. And of course, in 1989, 1990, we have the collapse of the Soviet Union. Eastern Europe is free from the Iron Curtain. East Germany gets reunited with West Germany. So there's just all these other opportunities to invest in other countries that just didn't exist before. So definitely globalization, by our second measure, movements of capital is definitely much, much higher. Third way to look at movement, globalization would be movement in people. Data is harder to find here, but let's look at some that I took from another resource, not the Deardorff Stern. Sorry, I chopped off that right corner there, but that's, we're looking at immigration or foreign-born persons as a percentage of the domestic population. And let's look at the far right. We have high-income countries. Gray is 1985, black is 1995, red is 2005. We see that immigrants as a percentage of mostly America and Western Europe has steadily increased. Of course, mobility of resources is in economics generally a good thing, but of course there's social frictions and other things that get created by this influx of foreign population. So that's part of that globalization and part of some of the resistance by some people to globalization. But certainly it is growing in the high-income countries. Interestingly, in low and middle-income countries, it's very low and doesn't seem to be rising over time per se. This is probably true, but probably also a data issue. A lot of middle-income and lower-income countries, I think, have pretty open borders, from my understanding. They don't keep track of everyone going back and forth. For example, Nepal and India, I think, has a fairly open border, unless you're a big truck and you're shipping stuff across the border. If you're just walking over to visit your relatives or to go to work or go shopping, I don't think they keep track of how long you've been across the border. So maybe this is not representative, but again, it points to the challenges of counting people. So more globalization people? Yes, probably. Certainly there's big events like the meltdown in Syria and the horrible civil war there, which Syrians are going to Turkey and to many other countries, and of course in Northern Africa, fleeing poverty and other things there, going to Europe. That, I think, is on the rise. Other countries like China do not have a lot of immigration. Japan has seen, in percentage terms, increases in large increases in immigration, but still the foreign population as a percent of the Japanese population overall is only a few percent. Tariff declines is one reason that trade has gone up. And let's look at some data here. This is from the Deardorff Stern paper. And we can see, again, going back to 1913, tariffs were average 20%. They go up really high in the 1930s because of America's trade war, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And then after the war, GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is the predecessor to the World Trade Organization, the WTO, they agreed to lower tariffs. At least the wealthy countries agreed to lower tariffs. And we see that they did a great job, and that we get to the 1980s and then to this post-UR, post-Uruguay round, 1994, 95, average tariffs are about 5% for manufacturing goods, which is most of global trade. Food, agriculture, mostly agriculture, still has very high tariffs in many countries, Japan, of course, being one of them. This is more data because the previous one didn't have Japan. We can see that Japan had higher tariff rates, but now they're around less than 10% or 5%, depending on which way you average them. And of course, if we look at that top screen, the United States has an average tariff of almost 60%, depending on how you measure it. But now, very open to trade, at least for manufactured goods. Trade. Trade economists think that trade is a good thing, but it does hurt some sectors and benefit others. And we're going to talk a lot about this semester. We think about static gains and dynamic gains. Forgive me if I'm talking a little bit too fast. I want to try to make these PowerPoints end in about an hour. Be sure to read the paper. You can always watch the video again if I'm talking too fast. But static and dynamic effects. But before we talk about that, just in general, economic theory, trade theory, and empirically looking at the numbers, we find again and again that countries that trade more do better than those that do not, GDP-wise. We're not saying that a country that trades more will suddenly become wealthy, but it'll move them in the right direction, and it won't make them worse off. I think there's a natural bias in journalists and media. They talk about the bad things less than the good things, and some people do lose their jobs and get hurt by trade, and those effects are immediate often, and we hear about that, and the other benefits are larger, we'll argue, but they might take a longer time, or they may be spread out across the population, and so we don't hear about them as much. About new jobs created by an Amazon logistics hub or hubs around America that add 50,000 jobs. We don't hear about that, but we do hear about maybe the auto factory that shuts down and has to lay off 5,000 people. A very famous study in 1971 by Professor Huber looks at Japan. Japan had a and their benefits from opening up to trade. As you may not know, Japan had this isolation period, this so-called Sakoku period, or chained country period, where from 1620 or so to 1850 something, all foreigners were kicked out. Very little trade in goods or ideas was allowed into Japan, basically upon penalty of death. The Chinese and Koreans and the Dutch were allowed to trade in Nagasaki basically, but Japan basically had a policy of isolation and no trade. But then after many, many years of pressure by France and Russia and America, they opened up, and they opened up big and became very free to trade. Average tariffs were maximum 5%, as stipulated in the treaty. And Huber calculates, and we'll maybe talk about this paper later in the semester, that Japan's the equivalent of a GDP, because they didn't have GDP back then, grew by about 65%, which was really big. No country would grow by 65% in a matter of 15 years in the 19th century. Now this is Deardorff and Stern's exact words, but I agree with it in its entirety, I suppose. Why do we care about trade and globalization? Why do we think it's a good thing? Well, because ultimately it raises the average standard of living across the globe, we feel. Not evenly distributed all the time, but on average it raises incomes. And as Jeffrey Sachs, a Harvard, now Columbia professor, I think used to say, it's not about making more money, but about people, especially in the lower income countries, being able to have money to buy better food, or buy more nutritious food, or to buy medicine for their children, or to have clean drinking water, or electricity, so they can their kids can do their homework at night. Not everyone. There's way too much poverty in the world. There's a long way to go. But we feel that trade and more trade has helped bring a lot of people out of poverty and raise income levels, which we think is a good thing. Now, the Heckscherling model, which we're going to spend a lot of time on this semester, makes a big prediction. It says that countries rich and poor, capital abundant, labor abundant, Japan versus India, they all gain from trade. But within those countries, we'll call US, Japan, the EU, the capital abundant countries. We'll call, say, a country like India a labor abundant country. But even a smaller country like Sri Lanka, a labor abundant country, because there's not a lot of machines per person. When a country like US or Japan opens to trade, the capital intensive sectors will grow, and those people who own those capital factors will gain. But then in US and Japan and EU, the owners of labor, especially low-skilled labor, which is a scarce resource, might gain, rather lose from globalization. And of course, we have anecdotal evidence of this. You think of a textile or the textile industry in America losing out over the last 20, 30 years. Was a labor-intensive sector. People are making T-shirts in South Carolina. They lose their jobs. It's real. That's something that the so-called Heckscherling model would predict, and that's what Deardorff and Stern are getting at in their paper. And you'll understand it more when we're done with the course. But conversely, and again, it's kind of blacked out, that last sentence, but the opposite should be true for lower income countries, or LDCs, so less developed countries, this old expression. So if globalization is good for both countries, we should see the benefits more so in labor in a country like India or Sri Lanka. And indeed, in theory, the owners of capital in India and Sri Lanka should lose in the short run. And Deardorff and Stern talk about that and whether or not that's really true, and we can discuss that throughout the course as well. In the long run, we like to think we all gain, and it seems to be the case empirically. Industries are growing and dying all the time. Salvatore, in one of the chapters, talks about, there's many studies like this, that find that actually most jobs and turnover and changing industries is mostly a technological story, not due to trade, but trade certainly also is one reason why industries change and new jobs are created and old jobs disappear. However, for the long run, if there's more jobs and better jobs at higher salaries, the next generation should be better off, in part due to globalization than before. So in the long run, everyone should gain from freer trade, as long as the young kids can move and go into the new jobs. So maybe a mother and father were working at a textile factory making T-shirts in the 1980s, and they lost their job because of globalization. But America has newer jobs and different jobs, and maybe their children won't go into a T-shirt factory for their career, but instead become a computer programmer or an accountant or maybe designing parts for an iPhone or something, or in the service industry in America at a higher income than their parents. Last 2 or 3 slides. In general, growth is good, we think, but there's a lot of problems in the world. Economics doesn't solve everything, but just some sort of stylized facts. We often say that when America sneezes, the world catches a cold, and by that we mean that if America falls by something like 1%, then lower income countries that tend to grow faster will fall more than that. This would be true for Japan, who used to be the second largest, now the third largest, or China. We want China and Japan to grow fast because we like them, but also because as they grow, they will help lift the other economies of the world. So their prosperity is our prosperity. Another site I have down here, Pinkowski and Sully-Martin. Sully-Martin is a very, very famous empirical growth economist, and he has many papers, but one paper he and his co-author demonstrate that Africa has not been left behind. In Africa, many people think that maybe Asia is doing great and America is doing great, and globalization is great for them, but maybe it's not great for many countries in Africa, and perhaps more so sub-Saharan Africa. And these two leaders experts in economic growth theory feel that actually, of course, there's so much poverty in Africa and many places of the world, but that they are sharing the growth, and growth is occurring there as well, according to their paper, at least in the last 20 years. Maybe that was not true in the 60s or 70s, but their paper looks for the last 20 years. Another famous study, although quite dated now, by doctors Dollar and Cray. I may have spelled his name wrong, I'm not sure. Dollar is the one guy's name. They were World Bank economists at the time. They look at this big study, something like 140 countries over 40, 50 years of data. They try to figure out why countries grow or don't grow. And they find that countries that trade do better than ones that don't. Countries that trade more tend to converge and catch up, not become rich overnight, but get closer to the high incomes of the rich countries. They also find that growth increases income of the poor about the same as the rich within poor countries. So it's not just that growth is benefiting Brazil, but only the rich people in Brazil. According to their studies, the rich and the poor are both gaining from global growth when it occurs. It's not occurring this year, but over the last 50 years it has. Now, a 10% increase in income for a millionaire is a lot bigger in dollar terms than 10% growth for someone living in poverty, but at least in percent terms, Dollar and Cray say that within poor countries, the poor are benefiting as well. And again, one way we can see that in many countries, especially China and Vietnam, is the poverty rates in those countries are just going down, down, down. And that's in part many things, domestic initiatives and education, but just new jobs created by globalization and working in a factory at a better job to export things to the rich markets of Japan and Western Europe and America. They also have lots of other control variables. Rule of law, property rights are great things for growth. If you don't have them, you're not going to grow. If you have civil war, you're not going to grow. Stable macro policies, no hyperinflation is important. Also, fiscal policy, there would be another macro policy. Responsible spending by the government all contributes to higher growth. Here are the references. You don't have to read the Dollar and Cray one. Yeah, it's got 2 A's in his name. You don't have to read the Pinkowski and Sully Martin, but they are available. You do have to read the Deardorff and Stern, which should be available online. So please check that out and let me know if you're having trouble with any of the files online. I think that's my last slide. Thanks for listening, and check out the next lecture when it becomes available. Thank you.